We're delighted, my brothers and sisters, to have as our speaker today a man who has been a friend of this institution throughout his life. Formerly president for a long number of years of a stake in American Fork, whose children attended this institution, and who has now been for a substantial period of time an associate to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, Elder Clifford E. Young.
I feel very keenly the challenge that presents itself here this beautiful morning. This is my first visit to your field house. I hope that what I may say may afford some source of inspiration. President Wilkinson announcing that this is United Nation Week, something that I had overlooked, leads me to make one observation. Many years ago, some of you older ones will recall, this government entered into a peace treaty, or rather into an international treaty governing the Panama Canal. Later on, certain phases of that treaty were violated by our own government, that is, by some of the officials of our government. And a movement was on foot in Congress to repeal the terms of the treaty which had been entered into in good faith between this nation and other nations. Something that was unethical in government and which might have led to serious disaster. Finally, it was given to one of the leaders of our nation, that is, one of our senators, to make this observation. He says, "We all love our country. We are proud of its history. We are full of hope and courage for its future. We love its good name. We desire for it that power among the nations of the earth, which will enable it to accomplish still greater things for civilization than it has accomplished in its noble past. Shall we make ourselves in the eyes of the world like unto the man who in his own community is marked as an astute and cunning to get out of his obligations? Shall we make ourselves like unto the man who is known to be false to his agreements, false to his pledged word? Shall we have it understood that you must look out for the U.S. or she will get the advantage of you? It is worthwhile, Mr. President, to be a citizen of a great country, but size alone is not enough to make a country great. A country must be great in its ideals. It must be great-hearted. It must be noble. It must be faithful to its word. It must keep the faith of its treaties. It must be faithful to its mission to civilization in order that it shall be truly great. It is because we believe that our country, it is because that we believe that of our country that we are proud. Aye, that the alien with the first step of his foot upon our soil is proud to be a part of this great democracy. Let us put aside the idea of small petty advantage. Let us treat this situation and these obligations in our relation to this canal in that large way which befits a great nation." That was from Senator Elihu Root. President Wilson, later on, used his influence with all the strength that he had that the treaty should be lived up to as it had been entered into. And thus we preserved an integrity of which we are proud in this nation. Now there are some things that disturb us now. We see a lack of integrity on the part of officials in many instances. I do not recall in my short experience when there has been quite so much malfeasance in office as we see throughout this country. There seems to be a selfishness that is not characteristic of our people. It's not characteristic of our nation. And thank heaven, these are exceptions among men. But unfortunately, these exceptions come into office, and they bring about a reflection on the integrity of us as a people and on this great nation. Well, this brings home to you and me two lessons that I'd like to emphasize in the short time that I stand before you this morning. One is the rare example that is set by the church that makes possible this great institution. Mr. E.O. Howard, who recently passed away and who was a very prominent Utah banker, Salt Lake banker, known throughout this country, at one time was not friendly to our people. He had not understood the motives underlying the leaders of this church. And like many who reside in Salt Lake City and who resided at that time, he had misconstrued the motives of the church and of its leaders, and he had affiliated with what was then known as the American Party, a party that was organized to weaken, if possible, indeed to absolutely kill the influence, if possible, of the church and of its leaders. It was the time when Senator Smoot had been fighting for his seat and had just been awarded his seat in the United States Senate. It was a time when they felt that for Senator Smoot to remain in the Senate would be a serious mistake. And so he, with others, joined in a movement against the church. Later on, Mr. Howard was to become acquainted with the leaders of the church. He was to become intimately associated with them. He was to become a warm friend of President Grant and President Clark and others with whom he was to become associated. And on one occasion, Brother Frank Evans, who passed away some years ago, but who was the financial secretary of the church, of the trustee and trust of the church for many years, Brother Frank Evans, in going in Walker's Bank on one occasion, was called over to Mr. Howard's desk. And Mr. Howard made this remark to him. He said, "Frank," he knew him intimately, "I want to say something to you after years of experience. I have never seen such integrity in business and in human affairs as there is at 47 East South Temple." He says, "I want to say that to you because of my previous experience and because of my recent experience, which is very refreshing and for which I am very grateful." And Mr. Howard, when he passed away, was a very warm friend of the church, and he appreciated its integrity. Now, that means a lot to you and me. I remember when President McDonald was installed over here. President Clark gave his charge, and then he made this observation. And it was just at a time when they were having some difficulties up at the state capitol regarding funds for the Agricultural College and the University of Utah. Funds had been appropriated, and then the chief executive had seen fit to withdraw the application of some of those funds Brother Clark made this observation. He said, President MacDonald, you may not have all the money you need. You may not have all the money you would like to have. But you can depend on it that when a commitment is made to you from those whose right it is to make a commitment, you may depend on that commitment. Now, I don't know whether you realize the importance of that. Now, the church committed itself to a certain sum, a large sum, for the erection of this building. I heard President Smith, President Joseph Fielding Smith, and you heard him say, if you were here at the groundbreaking of this building, that the church would like to have done it all. But you must remember, and I must always remember, that the church can only do what its people make possible for it to do. More it cannot do. That's true in government as well as in the church. We speak of the government as if it were something from which we can pluck money. The government can only do for its people what its people pay. And its people are paying now almost beyond their ability. And perhaps before this war is over, we will pay beyond our ability and our financial resources. And if that time ever comes, there'll be financial disaster in this land, and God grant that it may not come. But the government can only do for you and me and for anyone else what its funds permit. And its funds do not permit for us to be leaners on the government. Now, the same thing holds for the church. The church can only do what its people make possible for it to do. But that trust that's imposed in the leaders of the church, in your funds and mine, is faithfully and devotedly carried out. Now, I'd like to recall for you a statement that was made during our last conference, and it's been made during I don't mean our last conference, our last April conference. And it's been made during the last 3 conferences at least. In presenting the financial statement of the church, some $900,000 was earmarked in the budget for certain expenditures, among them the administration of the church offices and the allowances that are made to the authorities of the church, those who devote all of their time to the church. And it was stated in reading that statement that not one dime of that nearly $1 million comes from the tithes of the people. Now, the interesting thing about that is, my brethren and sisters and friends and fellow students, is that the tithings of this church are paid and covered back to the membership of the church for their benefit and blessing. And no funds of the church that come from the tithes are used other than for the benefit of the members, such as you, the schools, the seminaries, the temples, the missionary service, and other institutions, the meeting houses, their erection, and scores of other requirements that are made and demands that are made from time to time for the benefit of the people. Not one dime is paid out of the tithes of the church for the administration of the church. And in our last statement, even the administration of the tabernacle choir was included in that category. Now, the reason of that is a very simple story it is. Way back in the days of President Smith, President Joseph F. Smith, after the church had struggled to pay its debts, for previous to that time, because of persecution, the church had accumulated considerable debt. Much of its property had been taken away, had been cheated by the government, to use a legal term, and I'll let Brother Wilkinson tell you about that sometime. But finally, the property was restored to the church. At the time, Utah became a state. But the church was in debt. And under the able administration of President Snow, who served only 3 years, and later on President Joseph F. Smith, these debts were finally consolidated under some bonds, and then the bonds were finally paid, and the church has never been in debt since. But at that time, President Smith said, "We don't want that to happen again. So some investments were made. And I remember at the time there was a lot of criticism about those investments. I went on my mission about that time. And I remember even it reached over into Europe where I was laboring, not understanding the motive back of it. But those who know anything about it have lived to see that there was inspiration in the policy that was thus adopted. And during the Depression, the recent Depression, the church was in a position because of those investments to meet its obligations and to maintain and carry on its church school system, which doubtless could not have been done had it not been for that wise move made by the prophet of the Lord some 25 or 30, more than that, some 40 years ago. Now, I say that to you because I feel that we as a people should know of some of these things. Frequently we hear criticisms. Even today, why is the church acquiring these farms, these welfare farms? May I say to you, they're being purchased by the stakes of the church. Not the money, not the tithes of you people and the membership of the church, but by the donations that are made under the welfare program, by the stakes themselves. It's true the church becomes the central sponsor, but ultimately those farms and properties are owned by the church itself. And someday you and I will live to see the time, although we may not understand it now, we'll live to see the wisdom of it all, just as we see today the wisdom of those who made possible these great investments under the leadership of President Smith in order that the church might carry on and maintain its integrity. Well, now, the integrity of the church isn't always measured by money and dollars and cents. I'm not saying that, but we live in a material world, and we need material things in order to carry on. We need money to maintain this great institution and this great school. And you know and I know that the church will do for you and for all the membership of this church all that it humanly can and possibly can to maintain this great institution, one of the great institutions of our land. Recently there appeared an article in one of our magazines regarding some of the trusts of some of our colleges. It was pointed out that Harvard, because Harvard's a privately endowed school, as most of our eastern universities are, Harvard had sufficient means to carry on because it had had wise financiers that were able to make careful investments that would meet a depression. That was not true with the majority of the schools. But unfortunately, in this period now of inflation, many of our colleges are suffering, and they're suffering bitterly because of the devaluation of their dollar. Their investments are only bringing the same rate of interest, but their interest is only worth about half what it was, and it's hard to carry out their programs in the great demands that are being made. And schools are suffering throughout this land, the article pointed out. And as I thought of that, I thought again of the rare integrity of the men who make possible, because of their great leadership. They're men whom God has called, and we as students in this great institution should not forget that. Now, I won't have time to follow this through, but I wanted to say that much, that you might appreciate, as I do appreciate, that the men who serve this great church as its leaders are men who are unselfishly devoted to its welfare. And in that welfare is included you and every other institution in which the church is vitally and deeply interested. Now there's one other phase, and then I'm through, and that's the matter of individual integrity. And I think that's one thing, and you'll pardon me for being a little bit personal, that's one thing that we as boys and girls need to learn as we start out in the battle of life. I don't want to stand here and moralize to you, but I'd like to give you just a few thoughts out of my own experience. I had a young man come to me not long ago wanting a loan. I happen to have been connected with a little banking institution all my mature life. He came and wanted a small loan, or not a small one, but a loan with which to purchase a home. I told him it was out of our territory, we couldn't do that, and I suggested that he go to a certain institution in Salt Lake City. He lived there, where I thought they'd make it. Arrangements were made. He's a GI. Everything was set up for the loan. And on the morning that he and his wife were to come down and sign the papers, the cashier called him to one side and said, "I hate to tell you, but we can't make the loan." Well, he said, "We've been assured all the time that we'd make it." He says, "I know." And he says, "I regret this very much." But he said, "When we got your credit report, we found that way back you had repudiated an obligation." Well, that poor boy had to pay through the nose, if I can use a slang expression. He came back to me. I happen to know him well. He says, "What can I do?" Well, we tried to help him. But I couldn't help but think then, boys and girls and brethren and sisters, how important it is that we maintain an integrity. Now, you're starting out in life. Let me say to you, young men and women too, you become acquainted with your banker. They won't hurt you. You become acquainted with them, and you learn to establish a credit. It may be only $50. I don't care what it is. But you learn to establish a credit, and you maintain that credit. And I'll say this to you. I've never seen a banker yet. I know they're regarded as cruel and ruthless sometimes, and perhaps there are exceptions. But I've never met one that will not sit down with you and talk through a problem. If this young man had have gone to his creditors and have said, "I'm right up against it. I've had sickness and I've had reverses. I can't meet my obligations. But if you'll give me a little time, I'll not fail." There are mighty few men that will not go along with that sort of thing. We can, if we will, preserve an integrity. It doesn't take a lot of money. It doesn't take any money. Money does not buy integrity. But it helps. But in your starting out in life, let me just offer that suggestion to you. Become acquainted with men with whom you'll do business. And then carefully safeguard your good name and your honor in everything you do. That's the great lesson I learned from our church and from the leadership of the church. Remember, the word of our church is as good as its bond anywhere in this world because of the integrity of the men. That's why E.O. Howard said that he'd never seen such integrity. Now, Brigham Young on one occasion said to Samuel Brannan, when Samuel Brannan came out here from San Francisco in 1847, met Brigham Young at Green River to try to induce him to go out to San Francisco and to settle the Mormon people there instead of in these valleys. He pled with him. He landed there the 30th of June, followed Brigham Young into the valley, and stayed with him till about the 1st of August. Over a month, trying to induce him to go to California, telling him of its wonderful opportunities, but Brigham Young wouldn't move. But as Samuel Brannan left him, he had learned that the men of the Mormon Battalion and others who had gone around with Samuel Brannan had entered into contracts to work down in the San Francisco Bay Area. In those days, you used to have to enter into a contract. You'd agree to work for a year for a certain amount, or for 2 years, whatever the case may be. And as Samuel Brannan left Brigham Young, he said, "You tell the brethren to live up to their contracts, to stay with their word." Well, now, just to show you how that reacted, down in the museum in Sacramento, the old museum there, marking the place where gold was discovered, the old Sutter Fort, there is a document there in a showcase. And in that is a statement made by the old gentleman Sutter himself, in which he says, "The Mormon boys whom I employed lived up to their contracts. There were others who did not. Now, does that mean anything to you? Does it mean anything to me? And so I say to you, good people, the great lesson that we learn from this church, from its leaders, is this lesson of personal integrity in anything we do. That not only goes for business affairs, but in all of our walks of life. I'll tell you, if young men and young women in this nation would live up to their covenants of marriage, we would not have the social upheaval that we have today. That's another element of integrity. And thank God you and I belong to a church that teaches the sanctity of a marriage covenant, of the integrity of marriage. Now may the Lord help you and me to appreciate these obligations that are ours. I recognize that what I've said is just common, but I offer it to you from an experience that has come to me over many years. And I'm grateful with you for the great lesson that comes to us from the church that makes possible this magnificent school. God bless you. Amen.